If you're not new to the One Piece community, you've probably seen the big debate. The big divide that everyone insists has to be addressed. Which is better and why? Pre-timeskip or post-timeskip? That is to say, what span of chapters is better? Chapters 1 to 597 or chapters 598 to current day? This topic is one of the most prevailing and long-standing in the discourse of the series, and it's easy to understand why. The story seems to be splitting itself into two equal parts before our eyes, but upon seeing how people go about discussing these two halves, I notice a lot of people taking too many things for granted. For those of you who don't know, chapter 597 and the ones leading up to it are about Luffy and the Straw Hat Pirates preparing to take a 2-year break from their adventures in order to train and prepare for the threats in the new world. Chapter 598 being the ones where they begin to reunite. My thesis for this video is simple. People are attributing the majority of shifting trends that One Piece has went through over the course of its 20+ years in publication, and are trying to neatly sort them into two separate eras, that being pre-timeskip or post-timeskip. But in reality, that doesn't do justice to that 2 decades worth of history. I agree that One Piece has significantly changed in many ways over the years, but it has happened over the years, not right after chapter 598 dropped. But many people attempt to frame those trends into a pre versus post timeskip narrative, and I don't believe that timeskip is the big cutoff point many people believe it to be. I've compiled a handful of videos to help me illustrate this misguided attempt to address how and when exactly One Piece has changed. Before I address the actual narrative of One Piece, let's talk about its anime adaptation a little first, because this mentality applies just as much to that conversation as it does to one about the manga. Although I do see it less often, and I see much more people with a solid understanding of how the adaptation has changed over the years. But it is still there, and I'm a nerd, so I'm gonna talk about it. Our first video, How Toei is Ruining Post-Timeskip One Piece by Noble Absinthe, says Toei is ruining post-timeskip One Piece with questionable decisions in their adaptation, mainly through turning climactic moments into beam struggles.
Yeah, it's not a shonen anime without the sound of
I often do see people posing the question as to which half of One Piece was better animated and better adapted. But episodes 516 to 517 don't have a significant change in their art style or staff. Really, the first 2 significant and noticeable changes the anime went through happened far before the timeskip and wouldn't have a large shift again until far after. The first 2 changes being the transition between traditional, hand-drawn animation to modern digital, and the fact that the anime started adapting less material per episode, ultimately slowing down the pacing. What Noble fails to realize is that these beam struggles are likely an attempt to stretch the material to that 22-minute mark, instead of a purely artistic decision. He has much more questionable observations in another video, Toei ruined the Big Mom scene in One Piece. Now this video is actually something of a precursor to a second one, and it shows a lack of understanding towards the production process. I actually 100% agree with his critique of the scene in question. I'm not a fan of the One Piece anime, and I'm not gonna try and defend its quality. But he says that they spend months storyboarding episodes, and like, bro.
You might think that this is really all a petty comparison, but in reality, studios spend weeks to months storyboarding and drawing up how this scene will play out, banter within a room and how they wish to present certain scenes.
There's a new episode every week. Like, sure, this is true for many series, but only for seasonal shows, ones planned, made, and released in seasons. But One Piece has to have another episode ready every week. Now granted, they do have multiple teams working on episodes respectively, but it's still an incredibly tight schedule. In the beginning of the video, he praises the episode of East Blue special and says he would be happy if all of One Piece looked that good, but he never acknowledges how long the episode of East Blue was in production. Likely far longer than any singular episode. And this remark of spending months on storyboards makes me believe it's something he never even considered. This is a mentality that I most often see in newer or younger fans, or fans who don't watch many anime outside of One Piece. The anime did change, but because there's a pre and post timeskip era, then they assume the timeskip itself must have been directly responsible for those shifts. And it's an understandable mistake. I've never met anybody who can perfectly remember 900 episodes. But if you're somehow still not convinced, well, let me put it this way. One Piece has had 9 different directors over the course of its run, 4 of whom still work on One Piece, and they all split the work as episode directors. And that's just the directors. Imagine how many animators entered and left the production over the years, sound people, etc. Many times rotating on a weekly basis. One week you'll have Naoto Shishida delivering beautiful Phoenix Sakuga, and another week it'll be a lesser known or younger animators trying to rush out what they can get done in a small span of a week. It's a very inconsistent production to say the least. If I had to separate the production to eras, I would say there are 3 solid eras to One Piece's adaptation, and they can't be boiled down to a pre versus post timeskip narrative. And you're gonna hear me say this a lot throughout the video. There are so many swinging trends and aspects that take place at different times, that this pre versus post timeskip mentality is not as neat and tidy as you might want to admit. Our next video is going to be about the juicy stuff, the narrative and writing of One Piece and how it has changed. This is the part I really care about because it concerns the manga, and I am a manga man. These videos are Grandline reviews pre versus post timeskip One Piece, and Drizzt's The Downfall of One Piece. There'll be a few others here and there, but it's gonna primarily be these 2. Both framed in a pre-timeskip versus post-timeskip narrative, Grandline reviews being a direct comparison between the halves, and Drizzt's video primarily being a criticism of the second half. Now there are reasons to choose the timeskip as a cutoff point for a discussion. A majority of fans agree that the red line separating the world into 2 halves is symbolic of the story beginning its second half. Marineford is very easily read as a precursor to the second half, and to top it all off, the characters have new designs and are about to start adventuring again. Some creators have pointed out some neat thematic progressions between the 2 halves, such as Craftsdwarf, who's a cool dude, go check him out, here's a plugin. However, a lot of the reasoning I see used to try and separate and find differences in the 2 eras are ill-conceived. These next 2 videos, and by extension much of what I see in the fanbase, doesn't accurately describe a difference between pre-chapter 598 and post-chapter 598. Because many of the changes and trends lobbed as a praise or of a criticism one half of the story, in truth happened well before or well after chapter 598. Now to explain myself, I'm going to go through the points I have the most misgivings with. And please forgive me if I go on a tangent about some points I just flat out disagree with. It won't always contribute to the idea of seeing where the trends in the story truly begin and end. I just want to address them because I believe this prevailing idea that all of the massive shifts are the result of the timeskip have led to some bad faith observations. Now I'm not going to address all the material in these videos, mind you. Drizzt's video is 6 hours long, not all of it is bad, and not all of it is relevant to art purposes here. Please forgive me. Drizzt explains how One Piece's paneling has changed, and I completely agree with this point here.
Comparing the art of the pre-timeskip to the post-timeskip brings about almost a night and day difference. The interviews show that Oda feels an obligation to cram as much as he humanly can into panels, which can certainly be felt. Oda is decreasing the amount of tools he has as an artist because he thinks more equals better. Oda doesn't use spreads to the degree that he did in the past. He no longer uses minimalistic drawings as much either.
The manga has become more cluttered and has started using some unorthodox and frankly awkward page layouts to cram in as much material as possible. But he attributes this as a post-timeskip problem, when in actuality I believe this trend begins after Dressrosa, 200 chapters into the post-timeskip era. Dressrosa even has the last full unbroken double-page spread, and all of Drizzt's examples of crammed pages are from the last 200 chapters of the story, mainly Whole Cake Island and Wano. The whole paneling debacle is something I've seen well outside the YouTube space, and to help illustrate that, here's a collage I got from everyone's favorite hacker 4chan. And yes, the irony is intentional. As for the minimalism point, I think it's about as true as the one he made about the paneling. Because just skimming through the post-timeskip arcs for this video, I found plenty of examples that are comparable to the examples Drizzt used throughout Fishman Island, Punk Hazard, and Dressrosa. But maybe that's too anecdotal. This is a hard point to prove or disprove, but I think my stance is clear.
Corporate needs you to find the differences between this
character
and this
character.
Intel has told us there are at least 7.
Okay, I already see one. Give him. Okay.
They're the same.
By far, the opinions that ruffle my jammies the most are the ones that include the Straw Hats and how they have changed. Because some people talk like they are completely different characters to be discussed and considered separately. I've seen many people specify that their favorite characters are a pre-timeskip variant or a post-timeskip variant. Like they aren't the exact same character in the same series, filling more or less the same role. It's a far cry from, say, Joseph Joestar from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Part 2 Joseph Joestar is the protagonist, while Part 3 Joseph Joestar loses the mantle of protagonist and then becomes a supporting character, a role model, and an old voice in the cast. But now that Chopper is wearing a helmet and can control Monster Point, and has a little bit more confidence, people think he's no longer Chopper, he's now post-timeskip Chopper. Flanderization is a word that gets tossed around a lot, and I do believe it can be applied to One Piece. For example, Sanji's perversions being dialed to 11 is a perfect example of a character's signature trait being explosively heightened to the point where it can harm the character's narrative, or at the very least the perception people have of that character. Now there is an in-universe explanation for why this happened to Sanji. His 2 years surrounded by Okama has left him thirsty beyond belief, but that doesn't excuse any harm it can cause to his character. My favorite point in Drizzt's video is when he explains that Sanji groping Nami's body when they were body swapped goes against his chivalry. After all, the whole point of the Absalom fight was to illustrate that Sanji might be a pervert, but he's not a sex pest. When people say they don't like how Sanji changed after the timeskip, I completely understand why and how the timeskip itself was to blame. But I don't feel that way for every case. Not every Straw Hat has as good a case for a pre versus post timeskip discussion as Sanji does. But that doesn't stop people from trying. The most blatant example from the videos being from Drizzt, who despite acknowledging a prior example of Zoro's misgivings with cutting women pre-timeskip, can't connect the thread to his encounter with Monette post-timeskip, or how both of these moments connect to his backstory with Kuina, and how her death may have shaken the ideals he spouted to her prior to her death.
If you wanted to play devil's advocate for a moment, you could say that maybe there is still uncovered territory with Zoro on this front and Oda still has everything planned out. Maybe there's another flashback somewhere along the way. And I'd say, in response to that, sure, maybe that's possible. I think that you could logically write a scenario where, in an alternative timeline, Kuena's death makes Zoro jaded and sexist with women because he's hurt and he can't forget what happened to Kuena. That could work. But it doesn't exist.
This Zoro argument is tricky to address, because sexism is the word that inevitably comes up. Admittedly, in the past, I myself have called Zoro sexist for laughs, but that's not what's happening. I don't think Zoro's thoughts or actions are that extreme. It's not that Zoro looks down on women and doesn't believe that they can be strong. He just has a noticeable bias towards going easy on them. A bias that didn't take center stage until the Monette fight. And I think it's because of that fact, coupled with the pre versus post timeskip discourse, that has led people to believe that this is a new trait of Zoro's being invented here. But you can find examples of Zoro's misgivings if you keep an eye out. And this plotline makes more sense when you remember that Tashigi was literally the first female fighter Zoro had ever encountered, after Kuina of course. I've seen some people describe Tashigi's resemblance to Kuina as an ironic twist, and that's probably accurate. Most noticeably this Craftsdwarf video, and a close friend of mine whom I'm 90% sure got the idea from that video. But personally, if I had a criticism for this plotline, it would be for making Tashigi physically resemble Kuina. Because if all these other examples didn't exist, I would believe that the only reason Zoro didn't cut Tashigi was because she looked like his dead childhood friend. And I would probably hate the Monette fight as much as Drizzt does. Now, let's talk about everyone's favorite 6'2" waifu, Nico Robin. And no, this isn't about how the anime changed her skin tone, and then changed it again over the timeskip, to better reflect the manga. This is going to be about her character relevance. Grandline Review believes that Robin's importance has degraded post-timeskip, much more than the other Straw Hats. One of his main pieces of evidence is that Robin hasn't had an extended one-on-one battle since Skypiea.
The negative I'd like to state about the post-timeskip era is that this portion of the story has very much seen the decline of Nami and Robin as characters. These two were centerpieces of entire sagas in the pre-timeskip days, and in the modern times, they don't even get individual fights anymore. I mean, Nami's last one-on-one encounter was during the Enies Lobby arc against Caliphar, and Robin's was even further back against Yama in Skypiea. I'll say that one again, Skypiea. You know, around 700 chapters ago now.
Now, Robin recently got one of those in the ongoing Wano arc, but this video was released long before that, and I believe his point would still stand. But Skypiea ends 300 chapters before the timeskip. It's only the halfway point of the pre-timeskip era. Instead of questioning whether the story in general was interested in giving Robin more fights, Grandline Review lobs it as a criticism to post-timeskip, despite the fact that Robin could have easily been given a fight in that long stretch of chapters leading up to chapter 598. Just to be clear, if you want to say Robin hasn't gotten enough action post-timeskip, you are right. But I think the fact that Robin only had a single extended one-on-one fight throughout the entire series, until very recently at least, is a problem that applies to the whole series, not just one half. That's why I say Grandline Review's point still stands, because it's true. I just think it's not a criticism exclusive to post-timeskip. A lot of people criticize the post-timeskip era for giving less focus on the Straw Hat Pirates, and that's okay. But if you really want to have a discussion about the diminishing relevance of the cast, you shouldn't start it at Fishman Island. You should start it 100 chapters prior, when all the Straw Hats with the exception of Luffy were literally written out of the story, for almost 100 chapters and 2 straight years of publication. Why label it as a post-timeskip problem when the trend started and was arguably at its strongest long before the timeskip? And I know what the obvious rebuttal is. The Straw Hats physically were not present in Amazon Lily, Impel Down, and Marineford, but they are present in the arcs that come afterward, therefore they have less of an excuse. But the reality is the story, and by extension the author behind it, decided that it was okay for the Straw Hats to not get any screen time for 2 years. Just because I happen to like arcs like Impel Down and Marineford more than Punk Hazard, doesn't mean that those arcs should be excluded from the discussion. One thing that Drizzt gets right in his video is that the main reason that the Straw Hats get less screen time later in the story is because the scope and the cast begin to balloon and expand around them. But look at how many characters are in the Summit War Saga. How many different factions start throwing their weight in front of the audience. The cramped paneling we talked about earlier is actually used in abundance within the Marineford War. Some whole chapters being almost entirely double-page spreads with that unorthodox paneling. It's easy to see why these kinds of page layouts follow the 4 emperors and the huge warlike conflicts that result from the giant numbers of their crews. If I myself had to make a cutoff point for the last quote-unquote classic One Piece arc, I'd pick either Punk Hazard or Thriller Bark, because the chunk of the story in between Sabaody and Marineford are what opened the floodgates and truly made the scope of the story what it is today. And it's the arcs that begun nudging the Straw Hats to the side to make room for that huge scope. This applies to the character designs as well. Why blame post-timeskip for making Chopper's head as big as his body or for increasing Nami's bust size, when upon closer inspection, these things happened by the time Thriller Bark or Sabaody rolled around. Sure, the bikini definitely highlights it, but even putting aside that Fishman Island wasn't the first time or even the second time Nami wore a swimsuit throughout an arc, it also hasn't reappeared since the crew separated at Dressrosa. Honestly, Nami's design changes far more on an arc-to-arc basis than it did in between the timeskip. One theory of mine is that because most fans start with the anime before switching to the manga, the choices the adaptation made ends up spilling into the conversation. The anime does make some of these changes more jarring after all, both in how it handled the character designs and how it paces the story. Maybe people are just lazy and would rather describe all the changes as post-timeskip, even if what they really mean is new or recent One Piece. Another possible reason might be that the timeskip itself was such a distracting event that people decided that the second half was more significant or more different than it actually is. One moment in Drizzt's video, I believe, illustrates that mindset perfectly.
I'm sure, having come this far, that there is probably a question forming at the back of your minds when it comes to correlating the issues that I've been bringing up. And that question is, why is there more blame put on the post-timeskip than the pre-timeskip? It's not as if some of these issues didn't exist in the pre-timeskip, such as some of the foundational buildings for character dreams that I brought with Zoro, Nami, and Sanji, the latter of the three which have literally nothing to work with. Now obviously, it's not a good thing for any author to ignore these things, but the pre-timeskip has the luxury of being the first half of the story. It has the benefit of having time on its side. Issues and problems that arise in the first half which you couldn't correct for don't necessarily have to be disaster level if they are addressed in depth later. The standards that you have at the beginning of a story aren't necessarily the same as what you have at the end. A story takes time to get going, and authors need that time in order to figure out exactly what they want to do and how they want to do it. A certain amount of patience is needed from the readers in this regard.
I think his point has a nugget of truth to it, because most series will evolve, expand, and change with time. But drawing an arbitrary line at chapter 600 onward is just silly to me. 600 chapters is more than enough time to address any criticism you can possibly have. Most manga don't even last half that long. Is it impossible for a manga that's 100 or 200 chapters long to fix its shortcomings before they end? Of course it's not. 600 chapters is more than enough time for the story to do what Drizzt wants and explore the Straw Hat's dreams more. Just like how 300 chapters is more than enough time to give Robin another fight. So don't let this arbitrary cutoff point distract you and give pre-timeskip a free pass. Also, side note, the criticism towards not seeing the Straw Hats making physical strides towards their respective ambitions is a widely held and understandable misgiving, but it's ultimately one I disagree with. To put it plainly, even though these dreams are a primary motivation for the characters, the arcs and stories they participate in had given them all so much more to work with. Seeing Nami fill out her map simply isn't as interesting to me as her character arc about skepticism in the Skypiea saga, or seeing her come to terms with the history of the fishmen. And that first one actually illustrates so much about what it's like chasing after a lofty dream, and all the humiliation you might suffer because of it. Similarly, Sanji's dream about the All Blue itself is less important than the overall idea of his character. That being sticking to your code, living life your way, and putting your values before the ends. After all, if he didn't do that much, he wouldn't be much different than Absalom, Germa, or even Blackbeard. It's a theme that his character consistently explores whether you're looking at him pre-timeskip or post-timeskip.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme, every stanza kind of rhymes with the last one. Hopefully it'll work.
This idea of putting your values over the ends explores the theme of dreams in a meaningful way. I can empathize with the desire to see more breadcrumbs or tangible strides, but I ultimately don't sympathize with it. Maybe you think I'm just talking past these positions. After all, many people who discuss this do so in order to say that they didn't like many or even all of the 6 arcs post-timeskip. Maybe for individual reasons. Old thing good, new thing bad. And I haven't done much to defend the quality of the post-timeskip arcs in general. I could have written an essay about how Hody is a decent villain actually, or try and justify Dressrosa's length. Even though the Water 7 saga was longer, and no, switching locations doesn't magically make Annie's Lobby an independent narrative, because obviously the antagonist conflict's main themes and character arcs are directly carried over. But I'd rather try and convince people that post-timeskip One Piece isn't a different manga from pre-timeskip. Every individual arc is a sequel to every arc that came before it. I understand the desire to have that neat and tidy cutoff point that the timeskip presents us, but that mindset has largely misled and encouraged bad faith in my eyes. And I hope you can empathize with my stance. And that's the end of the video. Thank you all for watching. I'm really excited to be part of Novid this year, and I can't wait to see what everyone else has in store. Also, special thanks to Joe from Pause and Select for organizing the whole thing and coming up with a theme of Literature Review. It was a fun project and made me feel like I was taking high school English again. And if you somehow found this video without knowing who Joe is, then check his channel out. He does awesome work. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.